pleasure now to introduce one of Canada's most eminent environmental scientists, as well as one of Canada's most effective teachers. For the past 40 years, Bill Rees has carved out a niche at the University of British Columbia within the School of Community and Regional Planning, and I think part of Bill's legacy is in this room this week, because so many of the planners who are working hard to reshape Vancouver and other cities learned their craft in part under Bill's guidance and tutelage. Bill is, of course, also the co-developer of the ecological footprint, and he has a penetrating mind, a rigorous commitment to research, and the ability, I think, better than most, to take that research and intellect and couple it to applied policy in a way that should light the way ahead for all of us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Rees.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. That's probably the most generous introduction I've had for a long time, so I know I'm among friends. I'm going to also thank Jean, if I may. Can I have my slides up here? I have a particular reason for doing this, and it is that he gave me this title. And I said, what can you do with a title like that? What if can do can't? So I thought about it for a while, and what you're about to hear is what I've attempted to do with that title. Now, I haven't been tutored in how to work this machine, but we'll see if it works. Rob mentioned that I am a scientist, and I will speak to you as a scientist, particularly as an ecologist, which frees me from the burden of having to be practical for the time being. So I'm not oriented to design, I'm not oriented to city building per se, but what I want to do is to talk about the groundwork, and I want to start at the end of my presentation in case I never get there. These are the main takeaway points. And Nola Kate made some reference to this. The first point is that perception is everything. Our perceptions determine how we act out in the world. Cities are an emergent phenomena. They just don't happen. They come out of how we think about ourselves in relation to nature. So the structure and function of cities reflects how we think about that relationship. And unfortunately, our techno-industrial culture is a society of dualistic reductionism. We think of humans as separate from nature, reduce everything down to tiny parts, and we never seem to be able to assemble these in our minds as we go forward. So in this context, modern cities have emerged from our way of thinking on the landscape as fractured, incomplete human ecosystems. They parasitize the ecosphere in their present structure. For sustainability, if we're serious about this, cities must become much more self-reliant, much more self-producing, self-organizing. They must be much more complete as ecosystems. And I begin to think, when I hear these words, of something that I'm calling an eco-centered regional city-state. Provinces, by the way, have long since become obsolete for reasons I'll get to toward the end. There are two elements of context here. One is the science. By the way, I'm going to show no models, so those of you who are skeptical about models, everything on the board here is going to be real data. So these are real data about the human population explosion and the explosion of the human enterprise. I could have extended the x-axis into the next room for 50,000 or 100,000 or even 1,000,000 years. It would have been just as flat as the 2,000 years I'm showing you. And what you have to take from this is that the past 8 generations of humans live in a completely anomalous, abnormal period of human history, a period of growth. In fact, it's only been 2 generations of people since the 1950s in which economic growth or any form of growth has actually been an instrument of public policy. So what we take to be the norm is actually the single most abnormal phase in the history of our species. And if I were looking at any other species, I would call this the plague phase of the species, exploitation of its environment, which inevitably leads to implosion. I haven't got time to spend on the implosion part. The second part of context, again, goes back to the human mind. And it has to do with the psychology that Nola Kate talked about. I'm going to read the text and I'll explain it. And so, while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, the pre-end period is full of opportunities for profit. And that's exactly how we're approaching this issue. We have an intellectual understanding of the nature of our dilemma, but our response to it is to green business, to develop all sorts of ways to make additional money, to grow in a somewhat different way when we think the way that we do. So the can-do vision that Jean challenged me with, I think, is incorporated in the notion that we can grow differently using technology to move us forward in pretty much the same way as we have in the past without any substantial changes in our way of doing business. So there's a problem, but our response springs from our belief in human ingenuity and the incredible capacity of people to deal with crisis. It's always worked in the past. It will continue to work in the future. And perhaps the most ebullient expression of this is from the late Professor Julian Simon, who wrote many books with titles like The Ultimate Resource, referring to the human mind. Technology exists now to produce in inexhaustible quantities all the products made by nature. We have the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. That should stir you in your hearts, because this is the essence of true optimism. And by the way, it's also paralytic, because if you believe this, then there's no need to do anything at all. Well, I want to suggest that this attitude, this techno-fix approach, the can-do attitude has led us astray. Most approaches to climate change, global change in general, such as renewable energy, hybrid cars, green buildings, smart growth, new urbanism, green consumerism, a very long list, are delusional. They do not take into account the science in any significantly important, transformative way. They assume we can maintain growth through greater material and energy efficiency. It's really the status quo by other technological means. Now, here is really the key to what I'm getting at here. What the science says is that we need an absolute reduction in energy and material throughput in our economy of about 80% by mid-century to avoid catastrophic climate change. So you can accept it or not. It's probably safer to accept it if it's even marginally true. I'm going to assume it is true for the sake of argument. So the bottom line is that whatever you're doing, if we need that 80% of reduction, if your solution, if where you are working, does not result in an absolute reduction in energy and material use in your community, in your building, or whatever, then you're not on track. You're not part of the solution. You're really contributing more to the problem. So I want to give you a few examples of what I'm getting on here. This is a recent edition of the Ford Escape hybrid vehicle. Note that they appropriate one of our most powerful green cultural symbols, Hermit the Frog. That's a really authoritative figure. But the point is that we pander to we all want to be good, I want to be nice, so I'm going to buy this car instead of another car like the Toyota Echo, for example, which gets 50 miles to the gallon, but it's not green because it's not a hybrid. So here we have the appropriation of a cultural symbol in the sale of more goods that are frankly not a particularly good example of anything. And again, as Richard Register said, it just perpetuates the illusion that cities ought to be built around automobiles. And this is actually a fairly benign example. Try this one. This is the Chevy. I just scanned these from some recent magazines. This is the Tahoe hybrid. This vehicle weighs 7,300 pounds. That's 3.3 metric tons. But it's a hybrid. And because it's a hybrid, and by the way, it gets the lowest gas mileage of any hybrid vehicle on the planet, but it's a hybrid, and so it merits the Green Car of the Year award for 2008. Now again, people run out and buy this sort of thing because it makes them feel good about contributing to the planet. The only way to think about that is everybody drove one of these 7,300 pound or 3.3 metric ton vehicles, would the Earth be a healthier place? Which gets lousy gas mileage, by the way. How could it get good mileage? It weighs more than the average elephant. So, we're in cities, we live in buildings. We're all moving to green buildings, green architecture, green housing. So between 1950 and 2004, the average new house in North America went from about 900 or 1,000 square feet up to about 2,300 square feet, an increase of 135% over a half-century period, during which the green rhetoric continually accelerated. Okay? Everything about them is bigger. We've gone from you park your car in the lane to 4-car garages now not being uncommon in some of these homes. They all have industrial scale appliances, 9-foot ceilings, and so on. Meanwhile, while the house size is more than doubling, we see a shrinkage of family size from 3.7 to 2.6 people. So that floor space per capita increases by 236% during the period of the loudest green rhetoric you can possibly imagine on the planet. But these houses, a tiny fraction of them are about 25% more efficient per unit area as the 1950s house. So it's completely delusional to think we've made progress. These new large-scale so-called greenhouses haven't a fraction of the green associated with them as the primitive old 1950s 900 or 1,000 square foot houses. We're living in a complete fantasy land. And as I say, the way we think about things produces the products and the marketing and all the rest of it that is shaping the culture that is taking the planet down. Now, in that kind of context, cities could be resilient, but we've created them to be among the most vulnerable structures on the planet. I love this quote that I found. I don't even know where he said it, but Martin Oppenheimer, an American sociologist, today's city is the most vulnerable social structure ever conceived. They're threatened by peak oil, by soil losses, by climate change, by geopolitical instability. All of these things, of course, are tied together. I wish I had more time to explain to you why we're not even sensitive to this as yet, but I want to say that much of it has to do with the way we have conceived our cities. Cities are incomplete systems. They are not the human ecosystem. The idea of an eco-city in a way different from what I'm going to talk about doesn't make any real sense. So if you were to encapsulate Vancouver in a bell jar, or New York, or any modern city, it would suffocate and starve simultaneously. Because the productive zone producing everything needed to maintain or sustain the city is happening elsewhere. The city is the human equivalent of a livestock feedlot. It's where we gather large numbers of people, but the productive landscape sustaining it is scattered all over the planet. Cities have become, by virtue of the way we think about ourselves as separate from nature, parasitic blobs on the landscape. Horrible language to use. Vancouver's a beautiful place to live, but it's by far from being sustainable. We've known about this, again, for decades, since the beginning of the environmental movement. Eugene Odom, one of the great American ecologists, defined cities as parasitic. They are planned and grow without any regard for the fact that they must process vast quantities of waste and consume huge quantities of resources. Now, there's another fundamental physical law called the second law of thermodynamics, which makes the second two of these statements absolutely true. We think of ourselves as producers. We want to increase the productivity of the economy, of labor economy, and all of that. But the simple biophysical reality is that every act of human production involves the consumption of a vastly larger quantity of energy and material. So all human economic production is mostly consumption. Cities produce the wealth of nations only by consuming a vast quantity of natural wealth produced elsewhere in the ecosphere far from the boundaries of the city themselves. And here's an example of the parasitic nature of the human ecosystem, or rather of our urban culture. This is from Edward Burtynsky's new book on oil. I was honored to have written an introductory chapter to this. When I saw this photograph, I was floored because it reminds me I used to work in the far north. You stick your arm out the window and it'll be covered by 190 mosquitoes within 30 seconds. So these are mosquitoes, great mechanical mosquitoes sucking the blood from the earth and pumping it down to the city to where it's consumed in making a whole lot of other nasty things. So if you want to kind of image what I'm talking about here, just think of a number of pristine ecosystems, natural forests, grasslands, marine estuaries, coral reefs, or whatever. Now contemplate forests, clear cuts, eroding farmlands, depleted fisheries, and marine dead zones. The only thing connecting those two images is human economic activity, because that's the way we think. We're not part of nature, so it doesn't matter what we do out there, it won't affect us over here. Well, this is what's going on in northern Alberta. This used to be boreal forest. Again, a take from Bertinsky's latest book. It looks like an oil spill in your driveway, but in the middle there, I've pointed out a huge warehouse. This is tens of thousands of hectares of utterly desecrated landscape to feed the insatiable appetite of the Ford Escapes and the Chevy Tahoes in the cities far away, where this kind of thing is out of sight and out of mind. So, how much of nature do we actually appropriate in that way? And this is what we've done in the development of my ecological footprint concept. It's simply a measure of the amount of productive landscape required by any population, an individual, a city, a nation, to produce what it consumes and to assimilate its wastes. You all have a footprint. And because there's a declining amount of productive biospace out there, your footprint is growing as the available supply is shrinking, and as populations increase, we're all competing with each other, whether you're conscious of it or not, for the available biospace. We compete very successfully because we have very high incomes, enabling us to buy in global markets everybody else's eco-footprints. So the average ecological requirements of a person in this room is somewhere on the order of 7 hectares, something like 17 or 20 acres, in that range. The poorest of the poor live on a third of a hectare, just a little less than an acre. On Earth, there are 2 average hectares per capita. So each of us in this room requires 3 to 4 times an equitable share of the global biocapacity to sustain us in the style to which we're accustomed. And despite all of the greening of our economy, this number gets bigger year in and year out as our salaries increase and as technological gizmos fail because of something called the rebound effect. The principal biophysical impact of improvements in technological efficiency is to increase consumption. Counterintuitive, but there it is. Now, the problem is that many countries now, because their populations have such large footprints, live mostly on land and water productivity located outside of their own boundaries. Every country in Europe requires 2 or 3 times the size of its domestic biocapacity to sustain itself. What globalization does has enabled the wealthy countries to extend their footprints into the productive landscapes of other countries and into the global commons. Now, there's 2 evil effects of this. The first is it removes from consciousness our dependence on ecosystems, because we don't even see that we're dependent on our local ecosystems because we're not. Secondly, since everybody's doing this, it's drawing down the natural capital assets and filling up the sinks all over the planet. So as we blissfully move forward in our consumer lifestyles, we're actually all rising simultaneously to a lowering global ceiling, the true limits to growth. So one planet living would be living within the productive capacity of Earth, and if we did that, we'd have to reduce our footprints to 2 hectares per capita from the current roughly 7. But we're not doing that. Population is increasing. Per capita consumption is increasing even faster. So there's an accelerating upslope in terms of overall demand. This is now in exceedance of carrying capacity, we estimate, by about 30% on a global basis, which means that we are beginning to deplete the natural capital, the productive fisheries, forests, soils that we need to sustain future consumption. Even as we're in this state of overshoot, the productivity of the landscape is declining, and hence we're eroding our future prospects. Thinking of this in an urban context. Now, using our methods, a group under the direction of Dr. Carl Folke at Stockholm University examined the 29 largest cities in the Baltic states of Europe. That's around the Baltic Sea. So if we just average the total land area and population of those things and look at all the resource and energy flows and tie these back to the landscape, it turns out that every square kilometer, that's that little tiny square on the left-hand side, of urbanized land requires 18 square kilometers of forest in continuous production to provide the wood, fiber, and paper. 50 square kilometers of arable land per square kilometer of urbanized land to produce food for those people. These are big fish eaters, so it takes 130 square kilometers of the most productive marine environment for every square kilometer of those cities. The blocks on the right refer to the land requirements for the assimilation of the waste throughput. Everything that goes into an economy comes out as waste that must be assimilated. And there are two different sets of assumptions here. The black is a very conservative set, the other is a bit wangy, but the point is somewhere between 600 and 1,100 square kilometers of productive biocapacity of landscape and waterscape is needed for every single square kilometer of urbanized land in the Baltic states. And this is typical of large, high-income countries in Europe, North America, and Japan. Now, any sensible urban ecosystem would include within its purview the productive landscape needed to sustain the consumptive activity going on in the city. And until we move toward thinking of the city as an entire self-producing, self-reliant urban ecosystem that incorporates these productive landscapes, we're going nowhere. Our current way of developing cities ensures that we continue to deplete the very regions that sustain us because we don't even know they exist. They become invisible because of the globalization phenomena. Think of a city like Tokyo, which is a monstrosity. It's a wonderful place in many social and artistic and cultural, technological ways, but it's not supportable. Tokyo has 33 million people, the same population as Canada. Tokyo requires, to sustain itself, an area that is 4.3 times the area of Japan and about 2.1 times the nation's domestic biocapacity. Japan is very productive, but the bottom line is that Japan could not support its capital city on the entire biocapacity available to it were it cut off from global trade by climate change, international geopolitics, which may go rangy when we start competing for energy and resources, and so on. This is an unsustainable entity. And many other cities on the planet are following this path because of the assumption we can always have access to these resources wherever they are on the planet, as we exist in complete ignorance of the fact that we're depleting it even as we talk about this. So there are three major vulnerabilities to cities. The first is the erosion of agricultural landscape. Most cities couldn't come close to sustaining themselves if every bit of green area were planted to vegetable gardens or fruit trees. We need a much larger area than that. And right now we're losing agricultural land at an accelerating rate. We've lost enough in the last 30 or 40 years to feed all of Europe, for example, and the pace is increasing. Well, we don't notice because oil, in the form of fertilizers, pesticides, mechanized agriculture, have maintained productivity and increased it in areas, even as other areas are being taken out of production. The problem is, and this is our second vulnerability, the phenomenon of peak oil. Most of the major oil fields on the planet were discovered in the early 1960s. That's when the peak of discovery occurred. In the early 1980s, 20 years later, we passed the point at which every year consumption increases more rapidly than new discovery. And we've reached the point then where most people now who study this carefully think we've plateaued and are about to begin a long descent. And I don't care what you think about solar energy, wind power, or any of the available alternatives right now. I'm the guy who said we don't have the technologies ready to go forward. In total, they do not begin to replace the energy demand of society that is currently satisfied by fossil fuel, which is a real problem also because of the climate thing, which raises the third vulnerability of cities. The simple fact of the matter is that cities, our current agriculture, all of that depends on an extraordinarily stable period of climate during which the soils were formed and the agricultural development has occurred. If Canada warms up by 3 degrees and the agricultural climate moves north, it's going to move north into the tundra, the boreal forest. This is not good soil, and our best soils may not be capable of sustaining significant productivity. At any rate, carbon dioxide emissions, which are driving the human component of climate change, we're by no means the major part of climate change, but we're a major component at the margin. Carbon dioxide is the driver here, and carbon dioxide emissions are rising now much faster than the worst case scenario of the models. And I want to emphasize this. It's true that the climate change models are erroneous, but they're erroneous in the wrong direction. I could put up 100 slides to illustrate that. So we've seen increases since 2000, about 35% ahead of projections. This is what it looks like. Again, real data, not a model. This is from Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. The instrumentation is sensitive enough to catch the breathing of the Earth. The sawtooth pattern is the summer and winter oscillations. In the summer, plants are sucking up the carbon dioxide. In the winter, it accumulates. But every winter, a little more accumulates than was taken up in the previous summer, and so we have a steady increase. And notice that the increase is increasing from 1.3 parts per million in 1970 to 79 to 2.3 parts. It's doubled. The rate of increase in CO2 emissions or accumulations is doubling. And it has a corresponding impact on climate. Again, it's our jagged picture, but the trend is clear and upward. And notice in particular that between 1940 and 1980, it was actually seemingly cooling. So the fact that we're in a 2 or 3 year cooling period right now, not cooling, just slower rates of warming, doesn't mean it's over. It means that the climate is very erratic, and it will start ticking up again when certain circumstances I haven't got time to describe to you take hold. Now, here's the real kicker. The most recent studies, and this was just reaffirmed this week by the Hadley Centre in the UK, suggest that we are going to have one hell of a time restraining carbon dioxide emissions below 650 parts per million. Note here that we're already approaching 400 parts per million. The safe level over on the far left is 300 parts per million, and now we're seeing signs that because of the unanticipated uptick in this, that we're unlikely to reconcile below 650 parts per million. 650 parts per million means about a 50% chance of a 4 degree or greater global warming. Now, that is an astronomical change in global climate. In order to avoid this, we need to begin reducing our emissions. Remember I said the only thing that counts is an absolute reduction, by about 6% per year and accelerating thereafter in the OECD countries. No country on earth is coming close to policy that would even remotely approach this kind of target. So again, if the science is correct, we are condemning ourselves to a 4 degree world. And this is what a 4 degree world looks like. I mean, a 4 degree warmer in mean global temperature. All of the yellow and brown areas are essentially uninhabitable landscape. And you'll notice that includes India, China, most of Africa, that's about 3 billion people right there, a good part of South America, and about half the United States. The only places that come out ahead in terms of temperature, at any rate, are Canada and Russia, and they will be asked to accommodate the 3 billion other people who can no longer live in their territory. So this is not just dicking around. We're in a bliss bubble if you think that, green, lead, whatever is going to make any difference at all. It's just growing us more efficiently. And there's no particular virtue in becoming more efficiently unsustainable. That's what this message is all about. So get ready for it, because we've had a shipload of people land on the coast here. That's just a little preview of what might be happening in 50 years when hundreds of millions of people are displaced from coastal communities, from agricultural lands that are abandoned because there's no water or the soil has otherwise been depleted, and so on. There are dozens of studies you never read about in the news that talk about these consequences. Here are quotes from 2 of them. The age of consequences. We predict an inevitable scenario in which people and nations are threatened by, etc. I won't read these. But the point is, why aren't we paying attention? These are high-powered, high-paid studies of the social consequences of global change. What we mean, or what this all boils down to, and again, keep in mind, I'm assuming the science is right, I'm assuming we want to survive. The only thing we need to think about is how do we reduce our absolute contribution to the drivers here. And Again, it goes way back to an International Business Council on Sustainable Development meeting in Antwerp in 1993 that said, look, the data suggests, even then, that it's a 90% reduction in energy and material throughput in rich countries, because in order to create the ecological space, in my terminology, the eco-footprints of the rich countries have already appropriated most of the biocapacity of the planet to make room for those. The UN last week announced that officially now 1 billion people are in starvation, badly malnourished. That's the largest number ever in the history of the planet, and more people who were alive than were alive when Malthus wrote his original essay. That's the situation we're facing. And we aren't conscious of it because it's over there somewhere. But they say a 90% reduction. Our ecological footprint work says that if we're going to have sustainability with equity on a single planet that is shrinking, then we in North America should be working now to devise the social safety nets, the structural changes necessary to bring our per capita eco-footprints down from an average of 9 in North America to about 2 per capita. Now, cities have a huge leg up in doing this. I'm a great fan of density. I was somewhat behind the eco-density movement in Vancouver here, advising the mayor with a group of my students on how we might conceive of that. I know some of you have difficulty with the equity aspects of it, but that can be taken care of. The point is there's all kinds of economies of scale and agglomeration economies that emerge from higher density. These slides are freely available to anyone who wants them, so I'm not going to read this, but we need to go further. Efficiency is not enough. All the eco-density stuff is efficiency-oriented. We really need to rethink the city as the human ecosystem. We need to reconceive them and redesign them to incorporate as much of their supportive ecosystems within their own political jurisdictions as is possible. If you know that you are dependent on that acre, you will not permit unwarranted greenfield development on that acre. We are paving over the Fraser Valley despite the land reserves because we assume we can always import our food from elsewhere. The elsewhere is mostly California, which if you speak to people from California are now saying we may not have any agriculture in 50 years at the rate the water is drying up. They've had to shut down tens of thousands of hectares this year because there is no water. We have a very, very limited view of our own sustainability if we continue to think we can continue to, in effect, parasitize other places simply because we have the money to do so. So we have conceptual models, bioregionalism, learning to live more or less off the land base in your region, permaculture, which would double the productivity of our land base without having to resort to chemical pesticides and fertilizers and all of that sort of thing. So I'm thinking we really have to think 50 years ahead in terms of reconceiving the city as an urban-centered eco-city state. The provinces are obsolete. The Canadian Constitution makes no reference to communities, to cities. It's provinces and the federal government. But most of us now live in cities. Why not reorganize our settlements so that they are in charge of a significant resource base in their vicinity? Wouldn't work for a place like Tokyo. Tokyo needs other kinds of arrangements. But Canada, parts of the United States are capable of thinking this way. This is really going outside of the box so that we can claim this urban system as a complete, self-referencing, self-producing, self-sustaining, self-supporting entity that is not dependent so much on other places. It doesn't mean no trade, because if we have a network of these kinds of interdependent regions, they can exchange, but they exchange in terms of true ecological surpluses. And that's where we should be going. And it's actually an old idea, going back to some of the great planners, Patrick Geddes, Lewis Mumford, Ebenezer Howard, and so on. Now, a lot of people say, God, that bugger's, depressing. And listen, this is the good news, and I just want to take you through it. So I'm saying the science looks good to me because it's just unfolding exactly as we've said it would all along. So if we stay the course, in other words, business as usual, we're going to get accelerated resource depletion, accelerating global change, climate chaos, greater systemic pollution, economic uncertainty. Hey, we've had a lot of great economic stuff, coming out of the mainstream recently. A widening income gap, which is steadily happening all over the planet, including in our own country, increasing civil unrest, potential geopolitical chaos, and possible cultural collapse. Now, there's a really neat scenario for you, and it comes right out of doing nothing, which is what most of our politicians would like to have us do. On the other hand, if we take seriously the science and move toward an eco-transformation of sorts, we might get conservation and restoration of the essential natural capital we need to sustain ourselves: agricultural soils, forests, water supplies, and so on and so forth. We would have cleaner air, soil, and water. We would have a higher degree of economic security because we would plan social safety nets so that people who are being displaced from sunset industries into more sustainable forms of development have that transition support from the rest of the community. We need to recreate community is a message that's coming across here, which means narrowing the income gap. We need greater social capital and sense of community, greater political or geopolitical stability. See, down this path on the left, we're going to be at war within 40 years over the declining resource base. It's already beginning to appear in such things as Iraq and Afghanistan, and so on. So we need to move towards the right because the pressures are real, and we'll be better off for it. So again, this is the good news story. The political conundrum is the following. We can't muster the will to move toward eco-transformation. And it has to do with cognitive dissonance. Something else that Nola Kate mentioned. Human beings evolved such that as a person develops individually in a society, we take on the baggage of that society, the political ideologies, the ways of thinking, the Cartesian dualism I spoke about at the middle. And it actually helps to shape synaptic circuitry in the brain. And once that's in place, it's very difficult to shift out of it. Nola Kate mentioned we don't like change. Well, this is why we don't like change. It's in a sense hardwired by our individual development. And once it's hardwired, we seek out experiences that reinforce what we already think. That's why most of you are in this room, by the way. And we avoid, deny, or otherwise denigrate anything we don't want to hear about. And that's how we act. So we're always resistant to change because if it worked for my grandfather, it worked for me. And by the way, that was an adaptive strategy 3,000 years ago. If you survived in a tribal circumstance, it's because they were doing something right. Better to take on that burden. But now it doesn't work because the very circumstances that we have created comes from thinking that is destructive. And if we take on that thinking, we'll just carry on down this path. We really need to shift. The problem is what's ecologically necessary is politically unfeasible. But what's politically feasible, look at what we're doing in this country. We don't even have a climate policy, is ecologically irrelevant and will get us nowhere. So be the change, as someone has already said. And by the way, good luck. Thanks very much.